Now, I want to begin this lecture with comments in two areas. First of all, I want to emphasize the tremendous turmoil that's occurring in this area today. That is among the evolutionists. Now, for 130 years, the dogma has been Darwinism. The idea was that Darwin had provided a mechanism which made evolution reasonable. And it brought most of the scientific world over to the side of the evolutionists because they believed that Darwin had provided a mechanism. He didn't provide the evidence, really. He knew the missing links were missing. He couldn't find the fossil record to document evolution, but at least he provided a mechanism. So reasonable, plausible, that it brought most of the scientific world to his point of view. It's incredible. Today, the missing links are still missing, and more evolutionists are rejecting the Darwinian mechanism. This idea of slow, gradual change through mutations and natural selection and so forth. More and more evolutionists are realizing that it didn't work and it couldn't work. And that doesn't explain how you and I supposedly rose from a little microscopic bacterium or amoeba or something like that several billion years ago. They realize it's failed. And so they're searching for some other explanation. They're floundering, really. They're going from the frying pan into the fire because what they're suggesting is even worse than the Darwinian notion. But there is tremendous turmoil here. And of course, we creation scientists, we're just delighted. We find many of these evolutionists saying the same thing we've been saying for years. Here's an article published in Newsweek. You know, that's that marvelous scientific journal. This is April 8th, 1985, 3 years ago. The article was entitled Science Contra Darwin. That is, Science Against Darwin. And it's authored by Sharon Begley. And she says in the first sentence here, she says, quote, "The great body of work deriving from Charles Darwin's revolutionary 1859 book on the origin of species is under increasing attack, and not just from creationists." End of quote. And then she goes on and discusses some of this turmoil and this arguments are going back and forth. Then she makes a very interesting remark. She says, quote, "So heated is the debate that one Darwinian says there are times when he thinks about going into a field with more intellectual honesty, the used car business." Now, I want to emphasize that was not a comment by a creationist. That was by an evolutionist about his fellow Darwinians. Now, a few years ago, I was invited to Israel to participate in Jerusalem at Hebrew University, the first annual conference on origins and evolution. There I met Dr. Soren Lovetup. He's a Swedish scientist, very, very well-known Swedish scientist. He's an embryologist, well-known in the field. He's an evolutionist. There were creationists and evolutionists at this conference. Now, I realized he wasn't the usual kind of evolutionist. He didn't believe in slow and gradual change. He didn't accept the Darwinian idea at all. You don't have these transitional forms. The missing links are still missing. So you must have sudden jumps, sort of like a man named Goldschmidt suggested some years ago. Why we don't have transitional forms between reptiles and birds? Because there never were any. A reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg. That's the way it happened. Must have been a tremendous shock to Mama Reptile. Probably would have given up motherhood. But they said, look, there are no transitional forms. We have these big gaps. They weren't willing to accept creation, so they suggested something like this, and this was his idea. Recently, he's published a book, pretty good-sized book, cost us $85. It's worth every dime. The title of the book is Darwinism, the Refutation of a Myth. Darwinism, the Refutation of a Myth. Now, this man is an evolutionist. He's not a creationist. He's not willing to accept that point of view. But he rejects the Darwinian idea, the notion of gradual change and natural selection. He says, this doesn't work. This isn't what the evidence shows at all. He suggests these big jumps. Of course, one would have to wonder, when that reptile laid that egg and the bird was hatched, whether it was female or was it a male, and where would it find a mate? Happens so rarely, they say they never saw it happen. Nobody's ever seen it happen. Well, he believes in something like this. But here's an interesting comment that he made on this is on page 422 of this book, Darwinism, The Refutation of a Myth, published just last year by this famous Swedish scientist, evolutionist. He says, I quote, "I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science." End of quote. I believe, he says, that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. You know, dogma in our schools today, university. That is what most evolutionists teach. They are sold out to it. They believe it. In the history of science. Well, we creation scientists, we say not only Darwinism, the notion is science, we believe evolution itself. Could we as the greatest in the history of science? Not necessarily that these people are deliberately dishonest or anything like that. They have been completely deceived by their presuppositions and what they want to believe rather than what the evidence really does indicate. The Bible says in Romans 1:20 that none of us have any excuse, not a rag of excuse, because in the things that God has made, we can very clearly and easily discern certain unseen attributes of God. His power, His divinity, His creation are there for anyone to see. What has happened? Man worships the created rather than the Creator today. Well, we certainly believe that this is a critically important subject for not only the Christian, but the non-Christian as well. You see what is happening in our schools today. Evolution is being taught as an established fact. We hear this all the time. Pick up any book on evolution, and they say, well, evolution is accepted by all serious biologists. Of course, there's thousands of biologists who don't believe it, but they're just not serious biologists, you see, according to this definition. One fellow says all creation scientists are liars because they say they're creationists and they're scientists. He said that's impossible. You can't be a creationist and be a scientist, so they just lie about it. That's what we hear all the time. And our kids in the schools are, not all schools, and in not all classrooms. I want to make clear there are some teachers, quite a few teachers, as a matter of fact. A recent survey in the state of Texas showed that 30% of those biology teachers in the state of Texas were creationists, were teaching creation. Oh, that's terrible for the evolutionists feel. So I don't want to make this a blanket accusation, but I know this. The textbooks used in the state of California teach only evolution. And evolution is taught as a mechanistic, naturalistic process. God is not necessary, as we will see from the definition, which I'll describe briefly. It is a mechanistic, natural process. God is not necessary. God is excluded from the process. Kids are taught that. They're not told how creation so admirably explained this evidence. And so they become convinced. There is no God. There is no one to whom they are responsible. They're only responsible to themselves. You see, that is a philosophy that guides so much of the leadership of our country today. The legislators and educators and judges and so forth have accepted that philosophy, and their decisions are based upon that philosophy. And that's why we have the situation we have today, which we would never have dreamed of 50 years ago. Legalized abortion, legalized pornography, rampant drug culture where they say half of our kids are either using drugs or have used drugs. And even in many of the schools, the teachers aren't even safe. Where in my time, the teachers were not only safe in our schools, they were respected. And I never heard of anybody who used drugs, never even heard of such a thing. The doctors went to jail for performing abortions in those days. Well, we believe that these changes are unfortunate, and you can't blame everything on evolution, I realize that, but I think the major reason, because that's a philosophy, this evolutionary philosophy guides our thinking today. Because you see, evolution is directly contradictory to what the Bible tells us about creation. The Bible tells us that God created each kind, commanded each kind to reproduce after its own kind. He didn't command onions to evolve into roses or monkeys to evolve into people. That is not what God commanded at all. And he created man and woman in a very, very special way, which no evolutionist believes. I don't care whether he's a theistic evolutionist or an atheist evolutionist. He can't believe that. He can't believe what the Bible says about creation. He must reject that then. But in the book of Genesis, in the first few chapters, are the very foundations of the Christian faith. Creation, fall, the flood, dispersion, marriage. All of these important basic Christian doctrines are found right there. And if you reject those, then out from under comes the very foundation, you see. And furthermore, evolution is contradictory to the attributes of God. The main processes of biological evolution are two things: genetic mistakes and death. Now that's how evolution has occurred. That is, once you had a living organism, because the process involves these mutations, which are genetic errors. They're genetic accidents, and almost all of them are bad. I think they're all bad. I have never seen any convincing evidence that there's a single good mutation. But even evolutionists say, well, almost all mutations are bad, but once in a while, accidentally, one just happens to be good. And equips an animal or plant, now it's more viable or strong or something than the original. And so in this struggle for existence, competition for survival, it eliminates the original. How does it do it? By the death of the original. So evolution, our origin, is by genetic mistakes and death. I couldn't think of a more wasteful, inefficient method that anybody could conceive to create man, using several billion years, according to the theory of evolution, when God could have made man instantaneously if he wanted to. Evolution is contradictory to the attributes of God. It's contradictory to the plain proclamations of the Word of God. Difficult to understand why a Christian would believe it, but many do. Well, at least there's one atheist that understands the issue. His name is G. Richard Bozarth. He published an article called The Meaning of Evolution in American Atheist, September 1978, on page 30. Now, before I quote this, I want to make clear, neither Dr. Austin, nor I, nor any creation scientist has any quarrel with science. We are scientists. We are creationists because we believe in science. We believe in the scientific method. Our quarrel is with those who hold to the evolutionary philosophy and belief, you see. But this is what Bozarth says, and I quote, "Christianity has fought, still fights, and will fight science to the desperate end over evolution, because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. Destroy Adam and Eve and the original sin, and in the rubble you will find the sorry remains of the Son of God. If Jesus was not the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing." End of quote. You know, he's right. If we weren't created perfect, man didn't fall. If we have evolved from the inorganic, inanimate, dead world on up through all the organisms, we have come up. And according to the doctrine of evolution, we're still on our way up. Just wait a few million years. And so it is certainly contradictory to our basic Christian faith. Well, let's look at the evidence now. And now may we have the projector. I want to begin by just reviewing briefly the immensity and the complexity of our universe and of living organisms. What is it we have to explain? What is the burden, you see, on the evolutionists or the creationists? What do we have to explain? Now we need to turn these spotlights here. What I have here on this first slide is a star cluster of stars. This is the Hercules star cluster, about a cluster of 100 stars. Now each star itself is very complex. Now that's fine, just leave the light spot like that, that's great. Each individual star is a complex arrangement of matter. It's not simple at all. If you have gases just scattered at random, then there is no complexity there. You see, no structure, anything like that. When you put them in the form of a star, heated to tens of millions of degrees, that's a very complex arrangement of matter. And when you have 100 stars grouped together in a cluster, then that's even more complex. The next slide. See, I have my control here. Now here is the Rosette Nebula in Monoceros, complex arrangement of matter. The familiar Horsehead Nebula, very complex organizations. Then we have, this is the Andromeda Galaxy. We are told that there's about 100 billion galaxies in the universe. And that each galaxy contains 100 billion stars. Just think of the immensity of our universe. Not surprising, our God is infinite. And of course, when you put 100 billion stars in the form of a galaxy, then that is again a higher level of organization. And then we have other kinds of galaxies, the spiral galaxy, our own Milky Way galaxy, which we don't see anymore because of the lights of the city. As a little child in little hometown of White City, Kansas, 500 people, walk outside and just look up and see that gorgeous Milky Way galaxy. Our star, our sun, is one of 100 billion stars in that Milky Way galaxy. Then, of course, our solar system, utterly complex, works like a machine. No, it doesn't work like a machine. Machines wear out. Machines don't work perfectly, but our universe does. The astronomers can predict almost to a second when certain astronomical events will occur. In our solar system, we have 9 planets that we know about, and 54, 55 moons. And every time we send a spacecraft out into our solar system, we discover some additional moons. Here we see Jupiter and 4 of its Galilean moons. These were the moons that Galileo could see with his crude telescope. And then Saturn with its rings. Our space program has been extremely fertile for the creation scientists. We're finding that each planet is unique, uniquely different. Saturn has these rings here, which we've known about for many, many years, but a flyby of Saturn showed that those rings have a very, very complex structure, a structure that could not be maintained for billions of years. Astronomers, the evolutionary astronomers, are backed into a corner now because they've always maintained that everything in the solar system evolved or came into existence at the same time. The planets, the moons, the comets, the asteroids, and all of that, rings of Saturn, came into existence about 4.5 to 5 billion years ago. Now they must believe that Saturn itself is 4.5 billion years old, but the rings are quite young. And that's very difficult to explain that. And there's many other things about our solar system that's been surprising. Here we see not a moon rise, but an earth rise. The earth rising above the surface of the moon. Some of our astronauts on the moon and taking samples for analysis. Now, we did put an unmanned spacecraft on Mars. The results were staggering to evolutionists. Most evolutionists predicted that we would find life on Mars. Carl Sagan said, well, we won't even need a telescope, microscope. There'll be big forms of life on Mars. And at least most evolutionists believe we'd find some molecules there, amino acids, purines and pyrimidines and sugars and things necessary for the origin of life. At least we'd find that. What did we find on Mars? Absolutely nothing. No life, not even one single molecule of anything was detected. Now, of course, when the first picture came back from Mars, I knew immediately there was no life on Mars. Because if there'd been life on Mars, there'd be a great big sign up there saying, "Yankee, go home." Well, our tests were somewhat more scientific than that, but certainly revealed nothing. It revealed exactly what the creation scientists had predicted. Here was a natural experiment, no scientist there to interfere or impose anything on the experiment. Here you had a planetary surface, you had an atmosphere, not nearly as dense as ours, but an atmosphere with carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and so forth. And all that energy coming from the sun, what is required for the origin of life, according to evolutionists? And yet, there wasn't a single molecule there, just as we would have predicted. Tremendous support for creation. Well, if we were approaching our planet from outer space, we'd begin to see something like this. There'd been evidence of planning and organization and complexity. Then if we landed on our surface, we would discover the millions of very complex species that we have on the earth, including man. We have 30 trillion cells in our bodies of more than 200 varieties. In our 3-pound human brain, we have about 12 billion brain cells. And since each brain cell is connected to about 10,000 other brain cells, that means we have more than 100 trillion connections in the human brain. Think about that. You young people have absolutely no excuse for not doing well in school. Look at what you've got working for you. Just think of the complexity. More than 100 trillion connections in the human brain. And each individual cell in our bodies, these 30 trillion cells, are incredibly complex. Whether we're talking about a human cell or a bacterium, life is so complex. I'm convinced that if scientists could study it forever, there'd still be much about it we never understand. And the more we learn about it, the more complex it becomes. Well, how do we explain the origin of all of this? Where did it come from? How did everything get just so highly, precisely ordered? How can we account for this organization? For the tremendous information content that we find in a living cell or in our universe. How do we account for that? Well, as you know, one's the theory of evolution. I'm going to allow Julian Huxley, the British biologist and evolutionist, evolution for us. This is from his book, What is Science?, published in 1955. Huxley says, and I quote, "Evolution in the extended sense can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. Our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a theory that's being taught to our children in the public schools of California, in most classrooms. Notice what he says. You see, God, by definition, is excluded from this process. Not only is he not necessary, he is excluded because it is a process of self-transformation. It occurred according to properties inherent in matter. Notice that it is directional. It leads to higher and higher levels of organization. We've gone from the simplicity of hydrogen gas to the complexity of the human brain through this evolutionary process. And notice he says it includes everything in the entire universe. The stars and the planets and the galaxies, our solar system, the origin of life, the origin of man. Our consciousness, our ability to remember the past and plan, even our very faith in God, is just a product of this evolutionary process. You see, according to one of the popular theories on the origin of the universe is the Big Bang Theory. According to that theory, billions of years ago, all the energy and matter of the universe was crammed together in a cosmic egg of subatomic particles and radiation, heated at trillions times trillions of degrees. Now no one has the foggiest notion where the cosmic egg came from or how it got there. Some would suggest perhaps the cosmic chicken laid the cosmic egg. Well, I don't know, but more scientific argument than that, about scientific as I've heard. But there it was, and then the thing exploded, and out of this explosion, hydrogen gas was generated, and some helium. Now that's all, ladies and gentlemen. There wasn't any carbon. There was no nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, uranium, lead, iron, copper, anything like that. Hydrogen gas, essentially. And this hydrogen gas expanded out in the vast stretches of the universe. I call it the universe. It was the universe. I mean, that's all there was, just hydrogen gas. There was nothing else. And somehow, from this highly dispersed hydrogen gas, stars created themselves, and galaxies created itself, and the solar system created itself. Life evolved on this planet. And that first form of life evolved into everything living today, including people. So we've gone from hydrogen gas to people. Someone said, well, if this is really true, then we could say that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given sufficient time, becomes people. Well, now, we may laugh at that, ladies and gentlemen, but evolutionists believe that. You see, they have to believe that because there was nothing but hydrogen gas then, and now there's people. So, eventually, you can trace your origin back to hydrogen gas. Incredible. I don't know how anybody could believe this. Now, you didn't go directly from hydrogen gas to people, obviously. Hydrogen gas had to evolve into all many things, and then you see our creator gas. Well, that's one idea. It is a non-theistic, naturalistic, mechanistic, evolutionary theory, a process of self-transformation. The other viewpoint is that of the heavens and the earth. God directly the stars and the galaxies in our solar system. He created life, and he created each basic type of plant and animal. Dog kind, cat kind. He created the various plant kinds and animal kinds. He created monkeys, different kinds of apes. He created people. And they've been separate and distinct from the very beginning. They have not arisen from a common ancestor. We are not the result of blind, random forces. We are the products of deliberate, intelligent creation. Now that is the basic concept of creation, the basic concept of evolution. The very details, creation according to the Bible, we can find those here. We would not know scientifically, of course, whether God had created a single family, Adam and Eve, or thousands of families. We would not know scientifically whether God created in 6 days instantaneously, 6,000 years, or what. I believe that because that's what the Bible tells us. But what we can tell from science is that God did create, you see. Now, first of all, I want to deal with the matter of the origin of life. And I want to discuss very briefly the type of atmosphere that would be required for that. Now, today, the present atmosphere contains 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen. That is 99% of everything. The other 1% consists mainly of argon and some water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and other gases. Most of it is nitrogen and oxygen. The evolutionist knows life could never have evolved in the kind of an atmosphere we have today. It's 21% oxygen, if there were any amino acids or anything like that, they'd all get oxidized and be reduced to carbon dioxide and water and nitrogen, things like that. So the evolutionists must say that the primitive atmosphere on the primitive ocean was very, very different. Instead of containing oxygen, it contained free hydrogen. And not only carbon dioxide, but some carbon monoxide and methane. It contained not only nitrogen, but ammonia as well, and of course, water vapor. We call this an oxidized or oxidizing atmosphere because of the presence of oxygen. This is called a reducing atmosphere. Now, he must believe that, or something similar to that. Evolution is absolutely impossible in the presence of oxygen. But evidence is accumulating, ladies and gentlemen, that the Earth never had an atmosphere any different than we have today. Dr. Austin has published articles and material on this very subject and has a special lecture on the atmosphere. And the geological evidence shows that ever as far back as we can go in the sedimentary rocks, the atmosphere was the same as it is today. The geological evidence is there. And geologists are now beginning to realize the Earth never had an atmosphere with methane and ammonia and hydrogen. They cannot admit that it had oxygen. They're dead in the water. But there's accumulating evidence that the atmosphere has always had oxygen in it. And that settles the question. Let's go with the next lecture. You see, evolution is impossible in the presence of oxygen. But I want to talk about some of these experiments that have been done today on the origin of life, assuming such an atmosphere or something similar to it. Some of you are familiar with the experiment of Stanley Miller. This is published in 1953, some 35 years ago. Dr. Miller assumed that the atmosphere consisted of methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, and water vapor, and he put that in this apparatus. He provided an electrical discharge, a spark, simulating lightning. You've got to have energy for the order of life. Everything in the order of life is uphill. You're going in a direction which things don't want to go. You're going uphill. You have to push things up that way. Spontaneously, we know things run downhill, don't they? Obviously. So if you're going to go uphill, if you're going to go from the simple to the complex, you've got to give a push. So he provides some energy here. So he puts those gases in there, and he circulates the gas through this apparatus, and he has the electrical discharge, a very intense source of energy. And after a couple of weeks, he analyzes the solution in the trap. Notice he has a condenser which condenses the water vapor, runs down in the trap, carries the products, isolates them in the trap while the gases continue to circulate. After a couple of weeks, Dr. Miller analyzed the material in the trap, and lo and behold, it contained amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and a few other simple things. And the whole scientific world went wild. Look, they said, here under plausible primitive Earth conditions, Dr. Miller has generated amino acids, the very building blocks of life. And therefore, that demonstrates that life could have evolved from non-life. Now, let me point out, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, the very trivial nature of these results. What did Dr. Miller get in his trap? A few amino acids. They are the mere building blocks of proteins. They are the bricks from which you've got to build a building. So you have a pile of bricks in the parking lot. Does that mean that you're going to build a building? No, you have to put the bricks together. And you have to have the girders and the lumber and the carpeting and the plumbing and the electrical lines and all of that to build a building. What he did was produce a few simple building blocks of protein. He didn't produce proteins. He didn't produce DNA and RNA or anything like that. He didn't produce life, just a few little simple building blocks. And the only way his experiment was succeeded was he imposed something on the experiment that could never exist on the hypothetical primordial Earth. That was the presence of the trap. The trap is absolutely essential. The reason is this. when those amino acids are produced here, if once again they are hit by that spark, they'll be destroyed. Here's a very important principle here, ladies and gentlemen. Utilizing any source of energy available on the hypothetical primordial Earth, whether it's lightning, whether it's ultraviolet light, or what, that will destroy these products at rates that enormously exceed the rate of formation. By 1,000,000 to 1 or more. For every molecule you produce, you destroy 1,000,000. And if you take into account the rates of formation versus the rate of destruction, the rate of destruction completely overwhelms the system, and you have an infinitesimal amount of product. Dr. Miller got around that by providing a trap. The trap isolated the product, protected it from destruction. Unfortunately, on the hypothetical primordial Earth, there were no organic chemists with their traps. And you have these products forming in the atmosphere, and it has to filter down out of the atmosphere and reach the ocean. And during that time, it is being burned to crisp by lightning and destroyed by ultraviolet light, and practically none of it reaches the ocean, and the ocean is not a trap. In the ocean, there are many other destructive processes. So if you take into account all of these forces of formation versus the forces of destruction, you get a net quantity, and it is, for all practical purposes, infinitesimal. Because the rates of destruction vastly exceed the rate of formation. The only way Dr. Miller got around it, very clever device, which chemists use all the time. You put a trap in your apparatus. Now, there's no trap on the primitive Earth, but even if you could think of one, that would also be fatal. Why? Because if you isolate the product in the trap to prevent its destruction, what have you done? You have removed it from the energy source. You're dead in the water. How are you going to go to the next step? How are you going to combine these amino acids to make protein? That takes a lot of energy, but you don't have any energy. The very purpose of the trap is to remove the product from the energy to protect it from destruction. But if you bring in ultraviolet light or lightning or something like that, what's going to happen? You're going to destroy your product, aren't you? Do you ever get hit by lightning? Do you become more complex? You become more ordered? You get obliterated, don't you? Well, that happens to amino acids, and that happens to sugars and everything else too, you see. It's a ridiculous thing. That's an exercise in organic chemistry, which means nothing. Here's an article, a quote from an article published way back in 1960 in the British journal Nature by a man named D.E. Hull. I don't know whether he's a creationist or what. This is what he said. The physical chemist, guided by the proved principles of chemical thermodynamics and kinetics, cannot offer any encouragement to the biochemist who needs an ocean full of organic compound to form even lifeless coacervates. End of quote. A coacervate is just a little oily blob of material, no structure, no complexity or anything like that. Even to get that, you've got to have an ocean full of this stuff. And he says, based upon what? The proved principles of science, the proved principles of chemical kinetics and thermodynamics. You can't get there. It's impossible. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's with these simple things. That's just down there at the lower level. We're just trying to get a few bricks. But that's impossible. But we haven't even come to the difficult part yet. You see, the difficult part, we have to get complicated things like DNA. Here's a short section of DNA, and we have a sugar and phosphoric acid, sugar and phosphoric acid, sugar and phosphoric acid. Then we have the pyrimidines and purines, and you got to have all those chemical bonds formed. That doesn't happen naturally and spontaneously. I've done it in the laboratory. I've made these things. It's hard work. You have to put a specially kind of chemical reagents in there, and you have to make sure you put in this thing first, and then you put in that thing, then you put in this thing, and you all of that, and it's very difficult work. because you have to form all those chemical bonds which don't want to form. They don't form naturally. When they break, they release energy. That happens naturally and spontaneously. When you form them, you have to pump energy into it. So it's difficult. You're going uphill, you see. And you have to have a precise order of these units here for the genetic code, as we will see shortly. Or if you have a protein, you have to arrange the amino acids in a certain way, form those chemical bonds. And to get something like this is an enzyme. What are enzymes? Enzymes are catalysts. They make chemical reactions go very rapid, which ordinarily would go slowly. Life would not be possible without enzymes. You must have enzymes to have life, because the chemical reactions that are necessary for life ordinarily go slowly. Much, much, much too slowly for life. If you have these enzymes, these catalysts, they'll go very, very rapidly. We have to have digestive enzymes, for example. You ate supper tonight. Now that food, if you just dump it in a pail of water, it would deteriorate and the bonds will break, but it takes days and weeks and months. You can't wait days and weeks and months. You need that energy right now. You need that food now. So you have these digestive enzymes. We have probably hundreds of digestive enzymes in our digestive tract. One of those is this enzyme here. It's called the ribonuclease. That means it's an enzyme which catalyzes the extreme rapid digestion of ribonucleic acid, which you get in your food. You have to break it down into the pieces. This enzyme does that. Now, every single molecule of ribonuclease that you have in your body has lysine number 1. These are amino acids. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids in protein today. You know, the English language has 26 letters. You might say the protein language has 20 letters today. 20 different kinds. Ribonuclease has 124 of them arranged in precise order. Lysine is number 1, then glutamic acid, threonine, alanine, 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 lysine, phenylalanine, glutamic acid, arginine, glutamine, histamine, methionine, aspartic acid, serine, all around 124. In precise order, or nearly precise. You can make some changes, but not too many. You can make some typographical errors in a message, can't you? We read it, but you make a whole lot of errors and it's no longer readable. It's even worse here. Sometimes even changing one letter totally destroys all biological activity. Now we have enzymes that are protein made up of amino acids. We have hormones, growth hormones, made up of 188 amino acids. It's not an enzyme, it's a hormone. Then we have hemoglobin, the red blood protein that binds oxygen. Not a hormone, not an enzyme, but it helps the red blood cell to bind oxygen. These are all proteins. They're made up of amino acids. Why is one an enzyme? Why is one a hormone? Why does one bind oxygen? Or these numerous other things that our protein do? It's because of the precise arrangement of those amino acids. The same is true of the DNA and the RNA molecules. They are even more complicated than proteins. Thousands of units arranged in precise order. The gene that codes for blood clotting factor 8 has 186,000 units. 186,000 nucleotides in that gene. If one is wrong, your body won't produce this blood clotting factor in your hemophiliac. Now, I'm not saying the first forms of life had to have a gene with 186,000 units, but boy, we sure had to get from there to here by some accidental process according to evolution. Now, you see, when you have something like this, you can calculate the probability of that coming out by chance. The probability of lysine being number 1 is obviously 1 chance out of 20. If you only had 20, actually there have been many, many more than that. I'm making it simple for the evolutionists. Let's assume there were only 20 amino acids on the earth. If you selected that blindly by chance, you'd have 1 chance out of 20 of putting lysine number 1. What about glutamic acid number 2? 1 over 20 times 1 over 20, that's 1 out of 400. What about the chances of getting lysine number 1, glutamic acid number 2, and threonine number 3? 1 over 20 times the cell 3 times, 1 out of 8,000. What about the first 4? 1 out of 160,000. What about the first 5? 1 out of 3,200,000. What about the first 100? 1 over 20 times this cell 100 times. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could make 1 trillion times a second for 5 billion years, the probability that you'd come out with this arrangement is nil. I mean, for all practical purposes, it is 0. I mean, it's not going to happen in 5 billion years. Let me try to illustrate it with something more simple. If I'd asked 17 people to line up here in front of the auditorium, how many different ways could 17 people line up? I mean, just 17. We're talking about 124 here. I'm talking about 17. Let me tell you, to save time, it's more than 355 trillion. 17 people could line up in more than 355 trillion different ways without lining up twice in the same order. You don't believe me, do you? All right, after this. Okay, you don't believe me. Get 16 of your friends together after the meeting and you try. The universe will be gone before you make all those 355 trillion times. Do it on your computer. It's 17 times 16 times 15 times 14, 13, 12, and so forth, down to 1. More than 355 trillion. If I wrote 17 names down on a piece of paper and those 17 people lined up, they'd have only 1 chance out of 355 trillion of lining up the way I'd written down on that paper. That's only 17. We're talking about 124 here. You begin to get some idea of the impossibilities. But what if it did happen? What would you have? 1 single molecule of 1 single protein. And that wouldn't do anything. It'd fall apart in the next few minutes anyhow. You have to have an enormous quantity. I mean, as far as numbers of molecules, it'd be trillion times trillions in your body. You see, to get life started in an ocean containing millions of cubic miles of water, you'd have to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of protein molecules. You'd have to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of DNA and RNA molecules and carbohydrates and all of that. But you can't even get 1 single molecule by chance. And even if you had all of that, you'd never get a living cell. There'd be no way that that would happen. Because you see, life is just not a bag of chemicals. Life, for a living cell, you have to have a membrane, and these membranes are very, very complex. You've got to have energy factories, you've got to have protein factories, you've got to have the genetic material, and it all has to be put together precisely, just like the mechanism of a watch. That would never happen spontaneously. Those molecules would never spontaneously say, hey, fellas, we're just floating around in this ocean at random. We're not doing anything useful. We've got to get together and start cooperating and working together. Let's get organized. No, they don't organize themselves like a union. I mean, the tendency is in opposite direction, as we will show shortly. They're never going to happen, even if you had an ocean full of that stuff. Here's a newspaper article appeared in a London newspaper, the Daily Express, August 14th, 1981. 2 skeptical scientists put their heads together and reach an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Well now, ladies and gentlemen, that's not very amazing conclusion to you and I. But it was to these 2 scientists because when they began these studies, they were both atheists. One was the British astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle, and a friend, Dr. Chandra Wickramasinghe, professor and chairman of the Department of Applied Mathematics and Astronomy, University College in Cardiff, Wales. Also a very well-known British astronomer. Now, a few years ago, these scientists got interested in the problem of the origin of life. The first thing they did is make certain assumptions about the minimum requirement to get life started. what would be the absolute minimum required to have life. Then they calculated the probability of that happening by some evolutionary process on this planet in 5 billion years. The probability turned out to be 1 chance out of 10 to the 40,000th power. That's 1 chance out of the number 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. Let me assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that is 0. I mean, that is just nil. But they said, let us assume that every star in the entire universe has a planet like the Earth. Let us assume the universe is 20 billion years old. Now let us calculate the probability of life evolving somewhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. The answer came back, forget about it. The probability was so low, it was essentially nil. Sir Fred Hoyle said the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Well, I tell people, if you want to believe that, that's your business. But don't call it science. And don't teach it to your students. But that is what is being taught to our students. You see, these two scientists, based upon their religion? Absolutely not. Based upon the hard facts of science. Because these conclusions were contradictory to their religion. Because their religion at that time was atheism. They had no inclination to believe in creation. They didn't want to believe in creation. They much preferred to believe in evolution. But Professor Wickramasinghe said, I don't feel very comfortable with this idea, but I can find no logical way out of it. It was the hard facts of science that convinced them of the fact life could not have created itself naturally. There is only one other possibility then. It had to be created supernaturally. Therefore, they said, there must be a God. They are not Christians. They don't believe the Bible. But wherever life exists in this universe, they said, it had to be created. And you know what? They're saying the same things that we've been saying for many years. What I've been saying in the articles and lectures I've been giving for many years, these two scientists are now saying the same thing. And these are not exceptions. There are many other scientists saying this very same thing. You know, these evolutionists just sort of breeze over this stuff and you know what? They just believe that evolution is true. So it had to happen, you see. It must be true. And they ignore the science. They ignore the facts. The idea that life has evolved on this planet is nothing more than a nature myth that man has invented to explain his origin without God. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have given you only just a glimpse at this evidence here tonight. I see we're already over time. I wanted to talk about thermodynamics, which also just shows that the universe could not create itself naturally. The whole universe is running down and deteriorating. Every star in this universe is burning up its fuel. And if there is no God, or if God would not interfere, this universe is certain to die. Because every star in the universe will eventually have burned up all of its fuel, and then the lights are going to go out. And there'll be no life, no activity anywhere in the universe. Naturally, that's where the universe is going. Now, we know that God is going to intervene. But naturally left to itself, it's just going to burn out. So my question, you see, which I've asked evolutionists time and time and time again, for which I've never received a rational answer, is this. If the natural laws and natural processes which now govern the universe are leading to its death and destruction, and if, as evolutionists believe, these natural laws are all there is and all there ever has been, how then could these very same natural laws and processes which are destroying the universe, how could they create it in the first place? Is it possible that the very processes which are destroying the universe could have been responsible for its origin? What sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach such an impossible conclusion? You see, on the basis of science, on the basis of the science of thermodynamics, we know the universe could not have created itself. And so we say then, on the basis of science, the facts of science, the universe could not have created itself naturally. Life could never have arisen spontaneously on this planet. Therefore, the best statement we can make about their origin today scientifically is still, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you very much. Now we... Thank you. We are 15 minutes behind, but let's take our break, our 15-minute break, and then we'll have a slide illustrated lecture on the fossil record, dinosaurs, man, and everybody in between. And you may visit the book table perhaps during our break.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. Could I have you just be seated for a moment, please? I'm going to ask our ushers if they'll come right now.
Dr. Whitlow, did you want to say something?
Just say something.
Okay. By the way, I'm sure all of you who drove here tonight would like to drive home. Therefore, whoever lost their keys may claim them from Pastor Whitlow. Here's a set of keys. It's a beautiful little set of keys, Buxton top-grade cowhide. Let's see what kind of a car we're driving here. Oh, I believe it's a Ford product, maybe. Ford. All right. Somebody who drives a Ford has lost their keys.